Thanks. Just to introduce myself very briefly, I'm Rebecca Sheldon. I'm an associate professor of English at Indiana University, and it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you to Steve for inviting me to do this. It is an honor for me to introduce Steve Shaviro, who is currently DeRoy Professor of English at Wayne State University. Stephen Shaviro is the author of a dozen monographs and essay collections, from whose topics and titles an astute reader might reconstruct the most important shifts in critical theory into the 21st century. From the attention to affect and media in the cinematic body, connected and post-cinematic affect, to the somewhat skeptical speculative realisms of Without Criteria, The Universe of Things, and No Speed Limit, Shaviro's work has been absolutely essential in shaping the terrain of critical theorizing today. Our discussion this afternoon takes as its occasion the publication of Extreme Fabulations, Science Fictions of Life from Goldsmiths Press, a book that continues Shaviro's career-long exposition of science fiction's robust philosophical project in books such as his Discognitions, which won the 2016 Science Fiction and Technocultural Studies Book Prize from UC Riverside. Like Donna Haraway and Eugene Thacker, and really at this point countless other esteemed colleagues in the field of science fiction studies, Shaviro's work in these books is less concerned with explaining how and why to read science fiction as a philosopher than in wondering with humility and astonished zeal at the richness of the philosophical project that is already the remit of science fiction because it is fiction and not argument. I can say with some precision that it is because of Shaviro's work in science fiction that I am myself a professor of science fiction. Particularly, it was his 1996 book, Doom Patrols, that I read as an undergraduate that got me into this, where I am today. And so it's an especially sweet honor for me to be here to talk with Steve about his current work. Thank you to all of you for joining us. As Betsy said, I expect that we'll talk for about 40 minutes, although as I was preparing, I realized I had just lots and lots of things that I wanted to talk about. So hopefully we will restrain ourselves because we really do want the engagement of the audience. So we will have a question and answer moment at the end. But it's always a little awkward on Zoom to say, you know, join me in welcoming, but nonetheless, I'm going to clap because I like to clap. So you're welcome to clap or to give your little thumbs up signs. Thanks for indulging me. Okay.
Thanks so much, Rebecca, for that introduction.
Yeah, that's really heartfelt. Yeah. So I wanted to, you know, I really meant it that, you know, having the opportunity to sit down again with Extreme Fabulations and think about it next to a number of your current books, as I was preparing for this conversation, you know, it really reminds me that the simplicity of your prose, you know, when I really sit and think about them, you know, there's such complicated and interesting arguments, and they're given in such straightforward and readable forms. And it's just really a pleasure to have a moment to sort of think across these texts. So I will be referring to some of the other books that I mentioned in some of my questions. Okay. Yeah, I hope that's okay.
Yeah.
So I want to begin by picking up on what I was saying at the introduction about the way that you engage the genre of science fiction. So I have lots and lots of questions about this, but the one that I really want to start with is just to ask you to tell us about the way that you're using the term fabulation. It's sort of intellectual genealogy for you, and how you see it as offering something different, or, you know, but in tandem with terms like extrapolation or cognitive estrangement.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, a number of these terms have been used in relation to science fiction as well as to other things. Cognitive estrangement is the term invented by Darko Suvin, who's probably the most founder of Anglo-American science fiction studies. You know, I have a lot of disagreements with, but he is, you know, a kind of important starting point. Speculation is a term with multiple meanings. I mean, sometimes science fiction is called speculative fiction. Sometimes the two are differentiated, and sometimes speculative fiction is an umbrella term including both science fiction and fantasy and horror and other anti-naturalistic, let's say, genres. So speculation sort of means reaching beyond. I mean, it's a philosophical term. I I do not consider myself a philosopher at all. I do know that I'm dealing with, in the text I'm dealing with, are dealing with philosophical issues, but it just seems to me I approach them in a very different way. There are some philosophers who are very interested in science fiction and see science fiction working in tandem with philosophy. And I would, agree with most of them, but basically, speculation is kind of pushing beyond the limits of what you can justify. You cannot prove, if you're a speculation, you wouldn't call it a speculation if it wasn't something which you really couldn't argue for completely or prove. So speculation often comes out in hunches, though often good speculation is grounded in more than just, oh, I have a feeling that blah, blah, blah. I don't think it should be just arbitrary. In my current work in progress, I've been talking about 3 levels of science fictionality. And the first one would be extrapolation, which is a very common term. And extrapolation is basically taking what actually exists and pushing it further. Like, what happens if the climate crisis gets even worse, or, things like that. Speculation, I think, goes beyond extrapolation because it doesn't just project trends, which you can sort of do almost in a cognitively based way, and sort of asks what if on a much broader level. And fabulation would then be the third term, which goes beyond speculation. Fabulation sort of means, this crudest way to make it is just making stuff up, like, and trying to convince people that it makes sense. And obviously that's a very loose kind of definition. It's related to fables, and which are stories which presumably have some kind of reason for how they exist and things like that. In philosophy, fabulation, as far as I know, is first used by Henri Bergson, and he sees it both operating on an individual level and on a societal level. Fabulation is a kind of making up stories, but he sees they have a function which may be conservative or may be innovative. It can work both ways, but a function of, providing some kind of support. He gives the story of a woman who was waiting for the elevator, and she pulled the door open. There was no elevator there, but she hallucinated somebody in the elevator lunging at her, and so she stepped back and didn't step in, which would have meant she'd fall to her death. And so he sort of, Bergson says, the brain is fabulating to, because it would take too long to rationally analyze the situation. So and he uses it on a social level. So, in traditional societies, according to Bergson, myths and religious beliefs are fabulations. They're ways of inventing stories that explain things and that orient people. And in more modern societies, which are less traditionalist or which are often anti-traditionalist, he sees it as having a similar function, but being less so society-wide and less guiding and more a kind of exploration of possibilities. So that's kind of the philosophical sources taken up by Gilles Deleuze, who was a major philosopher who was very influenced by Bergson. And he talks about it in relation to film in various ways in his 2 volumes of cinema. I'm not sure who else is using it, but it's become a more widespread term since then. There's one book about Philip K. Dick, the science fiction writer, which explicitly links Dick to Bergson and talks about fabulation and sees fabulation as a kind of fiction which can save us. Yeah. I'm not sure as much about the saving part because I don't know. There's a wonderful collection of stories, or I don't know what you call it generically, called Extraordinary People by Joanna Russ, who's one of the major science fiction writers of the late 20th century. And she has these stories which are each published separately, but in between the story's being told to a kid who's interacting with a teaching machine in some future time when machines, teach young people. And at the end of each story, the kid says, "So is that how the world was saved?" And the teaching machine trying to know the world wasn't saved. And then you go to another story, and then at the very end, after the last story, the kid says again, "So is that how the world was saved?" And the teaching machine says, "What makes you think the world has ever been saved?" And then the author comments the last line of the whole book, but that's too grim, et cetera, et cetera. So it doesn't, I don't think these things necessarily save us, but they may orient us, make us think about things. They may provide, again, the question of what's true. I mean, literature isn't necessarily true. I think people, those of us in humanities, do feel that humanities subjects have a lot to teach us and to think about the world, and that they aren't just arbitrary. But how they do that is an open question. There are some philosophers who would talk about, Eric Schwitzgebel, who's a philosopher at University of California, Riverside, has written a lot about how science fiction is kind of an extension of the kind of thought experiments that philosophers often do. The late French philosopher Guy Laverdreau wrote a whole book in which he talked about the use of science fiction for philosophy as a way of supplementing the fact that philosophy cannot tell everything. He divides philosophers between those who claim to have the whole truth and those who say we can never get the whole truth. And he said the latter fiction makes sense because it's a way of thinking about stuff which we cannot know with certainty, which may be beyond us.
That seems to connect to part of what you were arguing, or what I understood you to be arguing in the introduction, which is that that fabulation has some relationship to indeterminacy or uncertainty. If you don't mind my quoting you,
go ahead.
You say that that these fabulations, and I think that this is part of the specific definition that you're giving to fabulation as opposed to extrapolation or speculation. That fabulations, you say, confront us with conditions that both overtly display to us their contingency or arbitrariness. So they forefront the fact that they are artifacts, or they're artificial, they're fictions, and yet at the same time they stare us directly in the face with their ineluctable actuality. Which, besides being a really succinct and beautiful definition of history, as I can imagine it, it calls us to that idea that we may not be able to know entirely what the future holds for us, and yet the fact that we can't know it doesn't mean that there aren't enormous constraints as we're actually operating within that future. And so you say, science fictional fabulation concretizes futurity. And I saw that sort of concreteness or the literalness with which you wanted us to take the, I think it's eight short stories, novels, and one work of one concept album that you read through the monograph, that what you wanted us to see in your analyses of each of these is the sort of the way that their situation, by giving us a perspective or an experience, demonstrates for us that historical circumstances are ineluctable actualities, even insofar as they are unavoidably contingent, historically determined, all of that, right? So that it is different from extrapolation because it has less of what I think you call a casino logic, right? That we can determine what the future will hold. Yeah.
Well, okay. I mean, yes, I take that very seriously. I mean, part of what I'm doing, there's several things I'm doing there. One is what you said about contingency and necessity. I don't think, not everybody agrees with this, because some people say that time is reversible and at the quantum level. I just don't know enough about science to know. But I mean, in a certain sense, that it's like Karl Marx said that human beings make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. And he talks about the nightmare of the weight of older generations upon us. I mean, part of that, what that means in part, is that we shouldn't think of our present state as fated in the sense that it was for all eternity decreed that we would end up this way. But so a lot of things which happened, which brought us here, are very contingent. They could easily have gone other ways. And in fact, alternative history is one of the subgenres of science fiction, which is sometimes quite interesting. But even if they were contingent, they happened. And once they've happened, you can't just imagine them away. What that means is that, now some people are determinists, or some thinkers are determinists, who say that everything's ineluctably fated for all time or whatever, or some physicists would say that have a block universe in which every time, space, location is already existent in a certain way. if you don't accept that, then you have, and you think that the future is to some degree open. It's open, but it's not just like anything that can happen no matter what, because we have the constraints of where we are now, and the future has to move out from where we are now. So one way to think about that is to think about, I'm using terms interchangeably, which maybe have different definitions, but I'd say that futurity is not the same thing as the actual future. So futurity isn't just what's going to actually happen. And many people, including science fiction writers themselves, are talking about how science fiction is not prediction of the future. It doesn't have a very good track record. I always think here of William Gibson, one of the most famous science fiction writers today, who basically invented the word cyberspace in the early 1980s and introduced ideas about the internet, which, though it's still more advanced than what we actually have, in fact, he kind of outlined a lot of stuff which would happen. But as Gibson himself has sort of ruefully said in interviews, he thought about all these powerful computers and people looking up to them in various ways, but he never imagined mobile phones. So even though his novel is supposed to be taking place in a future with all this computing power, you still have to go to a fixed terminal to connect. You can't just do it while you're walking in the street. It said, never entered my mind that people would have mobile phones, you know? So, I mean, that's a good example of how science fiction does not do a good job of predicting the future. Mm-hmm. But there are different things which it can think about. I mean, Isaac Asimov, one of the great classic science fiction writers in the mid-20th century, said, good science fiction is not something which imagined motor cars before they were invented. Good science fiction is something that imagined traffic jams before motor cars were invented. So certain things have potentialities and consequences, and we don't know which will happen, but futurity is sort of tendencies, potentials, which I think exist in the present moment, and which are very hard to see, and which we certainly can't delineate. But what a good science fiction narrative can do is take some of these potentialities and draw them out and tell stories about them, and thus, in effect, sort of realize them, at least to some extent.
Yeah, I love this moment in your chapter about Chris Beckett's novel Dark Eden, a novel that Steve and I originally disagreed about. I saw it as an evocation of evolutionary psychology and its kind of reductionism, and you convinced me in the course of this chapter that I shouldn't think of it that way, that I should think of it instead as what you call an act of speculative anthropology. The chapter has this great line. You say the problem is not that evolutionary psychology resorts to storytelling per se, but rather that its stories are so lame and simplistic. So this goes along, I think, with something that you say in Discognitions, one of your earlier books about science fiction, which is that the act of fictioning or fabulating is an inextricable part of the act of thinking, and that the act of thinking is itself just a kind of minor province in the various modes of consciousness that we can imagine. And so, I mean, it seems to me that part of what you're doing in these chapters is, imagining the experience and the perspective, the grounded perspective, all of the arbitrary but ineluctable situations that the characters get in order to show us something about life, which is the other term in your title, right? This is Extreme Fabulations, Science Fictions of Life. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see life entering into this.
That's a great question, and it's one which does not have an easy answer. I mean, there's been, again, it's something in which both philosophers and social scientists and speculative fiction writers have had lots of arguments about over the past century or so. An older philosophy was called Vitalism, and that sort of implied that there was some kind of life force which was not reducible, say, to physics and chemistry as they were then understood. And it was something which differentiated life from things which weren't alive. And I don't think, I mean, that in the course of the 20th century, that became unviable. It seems clear that life, we don't understand how life originated, we don't understand a lot about how it works, but we know that it conforms to, and it's a consequence of stuff we understand in terms of physics and chemistry. But what that might mean is that, materiality or brute matter, or whatever you want to call it, is actually, in a certain sense, more lively than we sometimes think. And here I'd refer, I think I may have mentioned her in the book, I've certainly written about her and others. There's a historian at Stanford, Jessica Riskin, who wrote an amazing book called it's something about a clock. It's something about the restless clock or something like that. She does a history of mechanism in European history together with speculations about mechanism and biology. So in terms of actual mechanisms, starting in the 15th century, rich people in courts all around Europe would have these kind of elaborate statues, which were mechanical wind-up things, which did kind of amazing things, like, would say things, or would do very complicated actions and so on and so forth. And people loved and were amazed by these kinds of things. And they knew that it was a mechanical contrivance. They weren't really alive, but they still wondered about what the implications of that. And from that, Riskin goes on to discuss how in the 18th century in France during the Enlightenment, there are really two theories, and going into 19th century, there are really two theories about life. One is that they both agree that life is mechanistic, it's not something magical. But one theory says that life exists because matter, this is Diderot would be an example of this. Life is possible because matter itself is very lively and kind of semi-vital, and it always does it has energy and force. It doesn't have other things. And that was the kind of atheist version. The deist or religious version was to say that life, everything physical, including living bodies, are just brute mechanisms. And that's why you need God to give the spark so that they come alive, because they couldn't come alive by themselves. So both sides agreed that life was a result of physical mechanisms, but they disagreed as to what physical mechanisms could do. And Riskin traces this genealogy in 18th century, early 19th century creationism through Darwin and post-Darwinian biology. And her point ultimately in the 20th century is that 20th century biologists reject the God part of the equation. They say natural selection can explain everything, but at the same time, they have an extremely reductive mechanicalism, which means that there's no kind of vitality to living things or to matter itself. So what's strange about it is that the people who had the most reductionistic view of matter only did this because they wanted to leave room for God. Contemporary science seems to have gotten rid of God, but they still keep that schema that is mechanistic. And that's why you get things like, it's hard for me to talk about this. I'm always afraid I'll insult somebody in the room because I know there are a lot of big philosophical disagreements and things, and anything I say is a little caricatural since I'm not a philosopher, but it's sort of like a philosopher like Daniel Dennett, who's one of the most best-known philosopher minds today, basically argues that stuff like conscious awareness, experience of qualia, or the physical qualities of things like colors, sounds, he claims that it doesn't exist, basically. He says this is an illusion that we're having this rich phenomenal experience, but in fact, we're not having it. It's all mechanistic. And he seems to feel that if he doesn't say that, then he'll be letting God in by the back door, something like that. But in fact, what Riskin shows is that it's only kind of 18th century deism or kind of religion that ever saw matter itself as being so passive and inert and without any qualities of its own. And that now it does have qualities. And if we understand that it does have qualities, then that gives us a very different kind of materialist view of things. So that's part of what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, and I think that kind of, part of what you're doing over the course of these 8 chapters is turning the diamond shape to see the different faces or the different facets of the consequences of that view of materialism.
Yeah.
And so you think about it in terms of, in the first couple of chapters, in terms of vitalism and mechanism pretty directly, and sort of the question about what thought can do. And then you talk, there's another sort of minor through line that connects some of the middle chapters that has to do with capitalism and biotechnology. And then there's a sort of third through line that has to do with systemic racism and exploitation and environmental degradation. And so each of these sort of gets taken up by the way that you're thinking about what science fiction allows us, science fictional fabulation, allows us to apprehend about the kinds of constraints that govern any attempt to understand or to manipulate future consequences, right?
Yeah.
I was really, I mean, I love all of the chapters, but I am especially, interested in the way that you end so the first two chapters are on Charles Harness's 1950 short story, The New Reality, and Adam Roberts' 2015 novel, The Thing Itself. You call both of them Kantian science fictions, and I was hoping you could help us to grasp what that category is. But you also seem to come out, so you sort of stage through these two chapters the mechanism vitalism debate, the way that it's taken up in these two short stories. And by the end, you seem to come out with this sort of imminent vitalistic materialism that you were just describing. And I want the book to end there. And then it keeps going and it just gets more depressing.
Well,
yes.
Okay, I'm not sure how to answer that. I mean, when I say Kantian science fiction, I kind of mean that quite literally. There may be others I don't know about, but these are the only two texts I know about where it literally takes Kant's philosophy in the Critique of Pure Reason as a science fictional premise. Okay, so Kant says we don't really know what reality is in and of itself. We're imposing our own categories of it and organizing an experience that would otherwise be totally chaotic through our own categories. And so we should understand that we have an anthropocentric bias, and we can't really get out of that bias because it structures everything. So I guess these two, this short story from the 50s and this novel from the recent years, both, say, oh, that sounds like a science fictional premise.
Yeah.
So we have a view of the world. There's actually other stuff going on where it's not accessible to us, yet somehow indirectly might affect us. So how do we understand this? And so both books, both narratives sort of deal with that. So when I say Kantian science fiction, I mean literally taking Kant as, every science fiction novel. Darko Subin, who's sort of I mentioned as one of the founding critics of Anglo-American science fiction studies, said that every science fiction has a novum, taking the word from Latin, and a novum, something new, is something that is something the way in which the world of the story is different from what we take for granted everyday reality. And even though Kant means what he says to apply to our everyday experience, still, taking that seriously is kind of creating a novum, this is the kind of theoretical or hypothetical premise that you will then explore in the course of the story. So, I mean, that's what I did. When I sent what I wrote to Adam Roberts, and he said he liked it, but he also had, even though he's himself a historian of science fiction as well as a science fiction writer, he had never heard of the other stories. So, and he was surprised if there was somebody else besides him who had actually used Kant as a science fiction premise. So it's random that I know some things and don't know others. So there might be something else, but I wouldn't know about it.
Well, I mean, I think it works as a subcategory
yeah.
science fiction. And, I think for me, the thing that's interesting about it is that it takes, the novum here is that you can build a machine that will allow us experimentally rather than philosophically to imagine or to know, not to imagine, to know things in themselves, the thing in itself. Or it
would go a different way. I mean, part of the point which both of these stories are taking is that Kant says that this is not the way we don't experience things themselves. We have our own categories. So Kant never mentions this, but you could ask the question then, if that's true, then does every entity in the universe have the same categories we have? What if it has different categories? It might not get any closer to the actual reality, but it might parse things in different ways. And, I mean, that depends on your accepting Kant's argument in the first place, which, I mean, I have complicated ideas about Kant, but as I said, I'm not a philosopher, so I'm a little nervous about going into that in detail, but it's certainly behind what I'm writing there.
Yeah, it's at the end of the second chapter that you, in fact, cite that Jessica Ruskin book that you were just mentioning before. You say, the imminent and non-theistic alternative, Ruskin says, is to understand matter itself as restless, moved by its own inner agency. That's the end of that quote.
Yeah.
In itself, intrinsically or noumenally, everything is already vital rather than inert. If we want to get away from anthropocentrism to break out of the correlationist circle, we need to give up our Lovecraftian visions of the implacable coldness, emptiness, and unconcern of the universe, and instead become more attentive to the many forms, categories, needs, and values expressed and imposed all around us by the vast multitude of clumping, convulsing, squirming, and burgeoning forms of life. It's a beautiful paragraph.
Thank you. You know, I mean, that's, again, I'm really trying to stick close to the text. I mean, H.P. Lovecraft is horror writer of the first half of the 20th century. And he's been much talked about in recent years for various reasons. And one reason is that Lovecraft himself was a kind of materialist atheist. He didn't believe there were any higher values, and therefore he believed that what we couldn't see, but beyond anthropocentrism, the universe would have to be an absolutely horrific place. There are other things, though, which people have been attending to in Lovecraft, which is that he was a violent racist, among other things. And I mean, it's sort of, one science fiction writer actually called my attention to this. Lovecraft lived in Providence, Rhode Island, but he went to New York tried to live in New York City for a couple of years. And he talked about but he was like so pathological. He was horrified by seeing all these multi-ethnic, multi-racial people when he walked the streets of Brooklyn. And it's just his vision of hell is that instead of having everybody be a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, you have all these different ethnicities and all these different colors and all these different, And I mean, it's very ugly. But what I realized at some point, and somebody at the point asked me, was that the people he's saying that he finds utterly horrific to see walking around the streets of Brooklyn are like my grandparents who lived in Brooklyn in the 1920s. And, my grandparents are the people who was having racist panic horror attacks. And it's when you get to Black people and to Asian people, it gets even worse, but so I mean, what's the relation between, one of the things that a lot of writers have been asking recently is what's the relation between Whitehead's vision of transcendence and his incredible racism. And he can only see what isn't part of his own anthropocentric framework or very narrow, say, Anglo-Saxon centric framework as being horrific. But there's a certain sense, I mean, we don't have to be that paranoid. We don't have to necessarily conclude that it's horrific. There may be a lot of things in the universe that don't care about us at all, but we shouldn't think that anything aside from our particular way of ordering things is utterly horrific. And what Adam Roberts does in the book, I talk in the second chapter, he basically says, I mean, this is my interpretation, he doesn't say it straight out, but he sort of says it. If you're talking about what we cannot fit into our framework, you can use Lovecraftian horror as one way to talk about it, but the romantic poet Percy Shelley talking about eternity and things like that is another way of thinking about it. He's thinking about something that transcends our ability or framework for understanding, but we don't want to give it a godlike transcendent power. We want to see in a materialistic worldview that nonetheless it makes sense as something we can't parse. And it's a definite political and social and ethical decision, as well as an aesthetic one, to decide that what's out there has to be ugly and horrific and destructive versus other ways of seeing it.
Well, it seems to me that part of what, I love that move that you made in that chapter to sort of draw together Shelley and Lovecraft, or I think in philosophy.
Well, Roberts already does that, I mean, in the novel, basically.
Yeah, and part of what you are doing here, part of your method, is that you are humble before the text, right? You really are just reading them. And I think part of the reason that you're just reading them that way is because that is your sort of, as I understand it, that's your theory of science fictional fabulation. It puts us in a situation. And so it's the situation and its literalness that we need to attend to, rather than making it an allegory for something else. Or so the plot is it's the place where the work is happening, where the philosophy is happening.
No, I mean, science fiction writers may just be thinking, how can I get a good story here? I can really hook in the reader. And a lot of the time that's what they say they're doing, and you can do, that's true of writers in any genre. One of the particular strengths and interests of science fiction to me is that among these multiple literary genres, it's the one which is most, even if the writer themselves are just trying to think, how can I make this a wacky story and bring everything together and blah, blah, because of the constraints of the genre, it leads them to make these kinds of speculations, which have further implications.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've shown some of these chapters to the writers of the texts. And when I showed Nalo Hopkinson what I wrote about one of her stories, she basically said, I wasn't aware I was dealing with all these issues. I just, I had this constraint. I had to make up something about something or other. And I just thought up the weirdest thing I could think of, which would fit the writing prompt I've been given.
Yeah.
And, I told her, yeah, but, a million years, I would never think of something as, wonderfully, nuts and beyond, convention as what you thought of. And that's what's great about what science fiction writers do at their best.
Yeah, I mean, it's that novelty that I think, comes from constraint that you're thinking about here. And that, that sort of, either the Shelleyan sort of, patterns of light, transcendence, or the Lovecraft sort of horror of the, cold, different cosmos. What you give us at the end in that passage that I read is a world that's just full. It's full of things that are already in action. They're already alive. They already have motives. They already have perspectives. They're partial.
Well, yeah, I kind of think that's true. It's not a necessarily consensus deal that everybody agrees with, but a lot of recent developments in, I don't want to say necessarily in professional philosophy, but certainly in kind of theoretical speculation in the humanities, at least in the Anglo-American world, has been along these lines. I mean, if you think of feminist new materialism, for instance, or if you think of the speculative realist philosophers of a decade ago, who I've written about in other places, I mean, they are much more saying, they're saying at least two things. One is that the only way we can deal with and even account for the climate crisis, which is threatening us so dreadfully, is to understand that it isn't just us, that we're intertwined with all these other entities, and that we shouldn't think that any entity except for us is therefore merely passive and dead and mechanistic in the bad sense, as opposed to us. We have to understand that other things have their desires and interests as well. And if you can combine that critique from the feminist new materialists with critiques coming in ethnic studies, and especially in Black studies, where which it pointed out the way in which, when we call ourselves humanists, very often the model of what is human and what is humane and what is centrally human has been completely a Western European white heterosexual model. And that all these other even from a human point of view, human beings are doing all kinds of things all across the world and have for thousands of years. And the traditional Western humanist ideal, which has reigned supreme since the 19th and 20th centuries, let's say, is very much ignoring all of that. And so that's why it's tied up with, racism and other things. I mean, it's very troubling to me that somebody like Immanuel Kant, who I do see as a major philosopher who really necessarily it's not his answers, but that he set the terms which we still have to kind of think in to think about the world, why he was a complete racist and why he assumed that non-white people were inferior and stupid and okay to enslave them and things like that. But this is really why. It's because whenever we talk about anthropocentrism, or whenever we talk about human values, as the humanities has done until recently, it's always been a very narrow, white Christian, heterosexual, racist kind of formulation. So there's a continuity between opening up to other human perspective and opening up to the whole universe of non-human perspectives, because both of those have systematically been shut out by the way the humanist tradition has been. I mean, this is something still very going on politically when you see of all these states where Republican legislators are trying to ban so-called critical race theory. I mean, it's completely trying to deny reality by holding on to a certain kind of privilege they have and power they have, which is based on oppressing other people. I mean, so it's still very much a live issue. And I think all these speculations are dealing with that. I mean, in science fiction in general, one of the things that's happened in the last 10 or 20 years is that both among authors and among fans and readers, there's been a boom in people of color, gays and lesbians, and trans people, and so on. lots more people, the profile of the average science fiction reader 50 or 70 years ago is probably a straight white male who is probably interested in engineering. Mm-hmm. Now it's just so much broader, and that's why science fiction has been such a vital and creative genre in the last 20 years or so.
Yeah. Well, so maybe I can ask you one more question, and then we can open it up to audience questions. I just thinking about what you were just saying and its relationship to that Lovecraftian, eliminativist version of the noumenon, and our ability to see it. I was really interested in the way that you link that then to a kind of war strategizing, because there are two sort of inheritances that science fiction gets that are less happy for us, right? One of them is the colonial relation to the frontier, and the other is the relation to speculative finance and various forms of surveillance capitalism, racial capitalism, and the sort of relations around biotechnology that those play into. And so, I was really interested in the way that you were thinking in this book about the inability to the indeterminacy of the future, the inability to really see the noumenon as a place where we might be able to control the future, or from which we might be able to control the future, right? And so then I was very interested in the end of the book, which has two kind of slightly depressing liftoffs into the unknown. One in Gwyneth Jones' novel Proof of Concept, in which basically a remnant of humanity it takes off for other planets, and in the clipping, in which there's only one person who is exploring the outer reaches of the universe. Maybe you want to talk more directly about those two.
Okay. So I mean, I'll say several things. One is, yes, it was quite by design that I ended the book with those two rather depressing narrative arcs. I don't know. I mean, again, going back to what you said earlier in the question, I think there are a lot of things which are packed together here. And one of the things is that I'm very interested in various kinds of futurisms, and as I said, in futurity as potentials which exist in the present, but which may or may not be unfolded. I mean, I think very much of Kim Stanley Robinson, one of the most important science fiction writers today, who compares science fiction to the 3D glasses you wear in the movie theater to see a 3D movie, where there are two different colors. And basically, he says science fiction, one lens is looking at the present and is making an allegory of what the present's like. The other is looking at the future and really openly thinking about what can be possible. And it's this kind of a three-dimensional picture comes out from the interference between these two things. I think that's a little different from the way I would phrase it, but it's a very good way to phrase it. And so, I mean, some science fiction can be purely just a satire about how messed up the world is today, and some science fiction can be utopian that envisions a much better future, and some can be dystopian that it takes what we have and extrapolates and shows it being even worse. And so, I mean, there are all those things going on. So the futurity is open in that way. I mean, I think it's important to believe or to maintain that against ultra-determinism, that things are not already fated to be, have to go one way or another. As we look at history, we can't change what happened in the past, but we see the contingencies which led to what did happen. So I think we have to believe that there are contingencies. I mean, this may be more a Kantian faith than something I can prove, but we have to believe that there are contingencies and that different things can happen, and there are multiple potentialities rather than a deterministic arc, which is already chosen, there in advance. But there is still a lot of reason not to be very sanguine, partly because we know so much more than we did 30 years ago about the ecological calamity we're facing, and yet arguably no government anywhere in the world is even trying slightly to do anything about it. So we're just because it's not reached the point where, life is totally broken down. Of course, if it does reach the point, then it would be too late. So there's that, but there's also the sense that, I mean, again, we seem to be ruled more than by anything else by speculative finance. So that's also, I mean, speculation has multiple meanings. It has a meaning in science fiction, which I'm using, but there's also the philosophical meaning, which is what Kant tried to stop us from doing, but he also admitted he can't ever stop doing it, even though he should. But then also the way in which financial speculation works. And my parents are both economists. My mother worked for 30 years for a federal commission which regulated futures trading. So futures trading, like 50 years ago, futures trading was that it's a way of dealing with uncertainty about the future. Is the price of corn going to go up or going to go down? This could really affect farmers because their income and the ability to continue next year depends. If there's a big calamity and all the crops destroyed, they don't get any money. But if they're so abundantly flourishing that there's too much corn, in the market, that there's also a problem. They won't earn enough because the price goes down so much. So there was trading in futures. In other words, as a kind of insurance hedge, you'd say, I'll agree to sell you or buy from you a certain amount of corn, 6 months from now. And then in effect, you're betting on whether the price will go up and down. You're betting on how the climate will be and things like that. But it worked to a certain extent to stabilize prices and to stabilize the expectations for the farmers. But it was also an area of speculation. And my mother's job as part of the Federal Commodities Trading Commission was to look for people who are trying to rig the market, trying to, monopolize things, or trying to manipulate prices so they get a profit no matter what happened. So anyway, that's something which only exists sort of for agricultural products and maybe a little bit for metals and things like that 50 years ago. But now it's basically the center of world finance about everything. Everything is being traded in terms of things like derivatives and other things, which is very hard for non-economists like myself to understand, are all being basically speculations about the future. And a lot of them have to do with creating situations where, on one hand, it means no matter what happens, if the price goes up, they make a profit. If the price goes down, they make a profit. But also manipulating the futures in certain ways so that no matter what happens, a certain corporate structure, a certain financial institution will have control over the market no matter what happens. And part of what's happened compared to when my mother was working 50 years ago is that the market has gone far past regulations, and there's been a lot of deregulation on the part of the Congress. So basically all these things which my mother worked to stop happening because they're illegal in a very limited context are now not only universal about everything, but also it's no longer illegal because either it's technically illegal, but you can never prove it, or it's not even illegal anymore because they deregulated. So we have we're all the victims of an immense financial market, which doesn't produce anything real, and yet which controls everything that happens economically, basically. And it's really scary, but I mean, what I'm interested in is the way in which that kind of speculation relates to the kind of speculation I'm talking about in science fiction, because they both aren't just arbitrarily making stuff up. They're both saying, here are if we understand the present, we can understand there's certain tendencies in the present. We don't know which tendency will happen. We don't know which potentiality will be fulfilled, but nonetheless, what we need to work with is these potentialities. So there's a certain sense in which corp finance today is like the nightmare version of science fiction, but in fact, it's actually in control of the world more than almost anything else is. I mean, so that's part of what I'm thinking about here.
Well, and maybe for me, the most hopeful image from the book is the reading of Anne Hamlell's Dr. Franklin's Island, which is a short story. Sorry, isn't it a novel? It's a novel. It's
a novella for teenagers. It's a young adult novel.
Right. About two teenagers who are subject to sort of enforced biotech transformations, transgenic transformations, as a way to basically test out commercial applications for transgenics, but who wind up, in addition to that, having these experiences of expansion and of freedom that are never intended, but are nonetheless present for them. So there's a kind of sort of weak hopefulness in that.
Well, I mean, the YA fiction, young adult fiction, is actually a very creative area right now, and I know you've written about it also, so you know this. But it's one of the most popular forms of science fiction or speculative fiction, and it's sort of, the rules are it deals basically with young people, with teenagers, and it usually doesn't have explicit sex in it. and that'd be two ways it would distinguish from that. But also sometimes it tries to pull out a happy ending. So I don't know, one of my daughters once said to me that she was tired of all these novels where everything's totally horrible, but if a young woman is plucky enough to find the right boyfriend, then she can liberate the world. So it's so silly and it's boring. Right. But you know, there are different ways of handling that. So Anna Lamb herself said that Dr. Franklin's Island is a postmodern rewrite of H.G. Wells's The Island of Dr. Moreau. And in the Wells novel from the 1890s, the mad scientist is trying to turn animals into rational, human-like beings. But it's quite a horrific process because it basically totally tortures the animals and makes them miserable, tortures them, and doesn't really serve any purpose aside from Dr. Moreau being able to say, I'm the god who's been able to do this. So what Anna Lamb does in her novel, she reverses it. The mad scientist here is a very up-to-date mad scientist. He has funding, he controls, various political strings, and what he does is not turn animals into humans, but turn humans into animals. So he kidnaps these teenagers and turns them respectively into a snake, a bird, and a fish. And it turns out that his idea is that this will be when I have the IPO, I'll become incredibly rich because everyone will want to go for a little vacation where you can become a bird for 2 weeks, then go back to your former form. So instead of the megalomaniacal, I rule the world kind of thing, you have, it's just a totally crass, yuppie scheme to make money again at the price of people's misery, So I'm glad the novel, teenagers get out of it at the end and they find a surplus. They actually they hated being forced to turn into these animals and not be able to be human, not be able to speak, but they kind of enjoy the fact that they have the power to do that at some point, just for fun or just for pleasure, just for learning new things. So,
yeah,
it's ambiguous.
Yeah, I mean, they don't save the world like so many plucky young heroines in YA novels, but they are part of that clumping, convulsive, squirming, and burgeoning form of life that our mad scientist has inadvertently contributed to. Well, so maybe on that note, we can open it to the audience for their thoughts and contributions. So, just to remind people, if you use the reactions button at the bottom, you can raise your hand and then I'll see that because you'll appear on my screen.
Anyone?
Okay, so thank you, Theo.
Hi.
Hi.
I really like thinking about science fiction as a place where we can imagine that other forms of life have different constraints on their epistemologies than human beings do. And I just, as you were talking about that, I just kept thinking of titles in which I feel like I can see that happening, and it made me want to give you this whole list of recommendations or ask you if you know all these.
Well, I'm happy. I mean, I'm always happy to read more stuff. I don't, It's too much written for me to have any kind of definitive thing, but I'm always looking for more stuff. And also, there's a lot of stuff I like but don't actually write about.
Yeah, so, sure. It made me wonder, like, do you read new weird writers like China Mieville and Jeff Vandermeer?
Yeah, in those cases, I read both. I try to read everything by both of them. It's complicated because on the one hand, I think distinctions like this is science fiction, this is fantasy, this is weird, this is horror, don't really always work. There's so many boundary cases. At the same time, you sort of need to have some way of classifying. You can't do without classifying them because then it's all chaotic. So those are both writers I like a lot. And I've written about Mieville a little bit in a book I'm still working on, and I wrote about several of Vandermeer's novels in my blog.
Oh,
but again, they're both writers who raise really kind of interesting issues. Again, weird is another, what's called the new weird is another kind of subgenre, or there's a whole history of this in science fiction criticism, because Darko Subin, who I mentioned is one of the founding people in science fiction studies in the English-speaking world, he just, he was writing this in the 70s and 80s and 90s before the weird became a category, but he just he really hates fantasy and like science fiction, insists that science fiction is rationalistic and humanistic, whereas fantasy is irrational and therefore Nazi, basically. And, there is I don't want to go along with that, obviously. But one of the things that's happened in recent years is that so many writers who are not straight white males have been more drawn, it seems, to fantasy and weird than to science fiction. And I'm enough of a science fiction person that I'm a little disappointed by that, but I wouldn't start fulminating about those things either. So there's actually a lot of, like, one of my favorite things, and a lot of people's favorite things over the past 10 or 15 years has been the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin, and that starts out as a fantasy, but eventually it's kind of becomes science fiction, or it's indecidable, or it's in between, because it's set in a kind of fantasy-like world, but there's all these remnants of a past technology, and it turns out by the end that it's actually a far future of perhaps, though not sure, our world.
Right.
And in terms of the kind of issues it raises issues which, to my mind, have more to do with science fiction than with fantasy. Questions of futurity and different potentialities in the way we deal with technology and the way we discriminate against people based on these technological structures and things like that. So again, it's really open. As I said, my personal kind of preference or thing is I really would like to see more science fiction, but I think there are understandable reasons why a lot of the new writing hasn't been as science fictional. I still get a kick out of a very lot of old science fiction, the golden age of science fiction, the 1940s, 50s, early 60s, before the new wave and before feminist science fiction, before cyberpunk. And a lot of them are very interesting in all kinds of ways, but usually they're written by straight white men who have had horrible women characters or no women characters at all. There's like a limit. I'm a big fan of taking things. If there are things I like in it, I try to just ignore the things which are bad or which are left out and see what I can do with the stuff that's there. But it's still, so I really like this old science fiction. At the same time, it's almost always cringe-inducing at the same time, at least to some extent, because of how they depict women or non-white people or whatever, So, it's difficult.
Yeah.
If I could jump in before Betsy, just very briefly, to say that it seems to me that in relation to Theo's question, and thank you for the question about new weird, that part of the interest in Fabulation that I have comes from the way that it is part of a kind of movement that I'm thinking here of Tavi Nyong'o's Afro-Fabulations and his sort of but also Catherine McKittrick's focus on story, and Donna Haraway's Camille stories, and the sense that there's something, that insofar as the things that present themselves as true are already a part of a kind of racist system that presenting things and falsify, right? Create false ideas about truth or images into the world. Then what we need is something that is actually false in order to falsify the things that are presented as true but are in fact false, and that means that something like fantasy or magic is an important resource in that in the powers of the false or the powers of fabulation, specifically in terms of the history of racism.
So I entirely agree with that, but I still, then this may just be my own peculiarity, that I still hope for that to be worked through in a more traditionally science fictional framework, maybe just because, what can I say? I'm not sure I could say I have science envy, but I really, I'm really into science and read a lot of pop science when I can't understand the mathematics of the actual science. And, that's why in one of my previous books, I had most of the chapters be about science fiction narratives, but then the last chapter was about slime molds, which are these incredibly bizarre organisms, which, seem like science fiction creations, even though they're actually real. And I see them on the campus every summer, so.
Betsy.
Thank you. This builds a little bit, I think, on Theo's question, and I was curious because I noticed. So you have this collection of works that certainly with the concept album, different forms in the sense that they take, but you also span from 1950 to 2017.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on kind of the methods behind the selection of these particular works. And you mentioned that you write about things that you're interested in, but I was wondering if there was something else that made these particularly cohesive, or again, how you settled on these in amongst a variety of other kinds of materials.
No, I mean, that's a great question. It's also a question which I actually get asked a lot about other work as well as this, and which I, in a certain sense, I don't have any good answer for. I mean, I believe it's important to know context. So, you don't write about a book without having any idea about what other books are being written and what the social conditions are and so on and so forth. But I really tend to just choose sort of ones which are just points I just, which obsess me or which I love or which freak me out or give me a sense of wonder or whatever. And I don't worry too much about being comprehensive. So in a certain sense, I'm guilty of not having a good methodological reason for which things I choose. And in fact, this book is mostly post-2000, except for 2 short stories from the 1950s, which are just things which I actually remembered reading as a teenager and which still seem relevant in certain ways. So which is why I sort of picked them up. But I mean, I get this, as I said, not only in my work with science fiction, but in work about other things, because I talk about author X, but I don't talk about author Y, who might be just as important in general. But this comes up in other ways. I was reading, last week was a conference I used to go to frequently, International Conference on the Fantastic and the Arts. And because I'm still, at least to some extent, nervous about COVID and so on, I didn't go this year. But I've read from friends of mine on Facebook accounts of people who went. And one of the talks, Farah Mendelssohn, who's British, but who's one of the most important commentators in science fiction, fantasy, and other genres, pointed out that the science fiction writers who academics in general write about are not the ones who are the best-selling ones. And if you looked at the most important ones in terms of sales, you'd have a different list than the one not just me, but academics in general are writing about. And again, I don't think you can avoid, I mean, being comprehensive and being encyclopedic is a worthy ambition. It's not something I'm particularly good at. It's certainly not something I would ever scorn or diss or whatever, but it's not what I know how to do or what I'm good at doing. So I kind of think, I choose things because it's subjective and aesthetic. They appeal to me in a certain way. I write about them if I think I can do something interesting with them, which brings up issues which are important to me. But again, another one, you can't read anything without, or listen to anything or whatever without having some kind of categorization scheme. And that's the kind of Kantian thing I was talking about in the book. We don't just approach everything as singular, as unrelated to everything else. We have certain schemas in our minds which we project onto things, which are how we classify the world, and which, we couldn't even cross the street if we didn't have these things, let alone read books and write about them. But at the same time, you want to give a little play, not be so dogmatic about your categories that even though you can't do without them, you don't want to just like turn them into a box. So there's always a question whenever anybody's writing, especially in academia, in the literature and in film and academic humanities more generally, there's always a struggle between people who are using various theories and people who are trying to not make the fictions as just exemplifying the theories. Mm-hmm. It's a danger because it's a naive to think you can get away with it, get away from it and avoid it, and just purely talk about this book itself without talking about that, I'm reading it in a more Deleuzean way and somebody else might read it in a more Lacanian way. I don't think you need those ways, because without them, again, we'd have no organization at all, and we wouldn't even be able to follow lines of thought. But again, you need to be skeptical about them and not have them be too much of a vise, which is like constraining you as well as constraining whatever text you're writing about into them. That's the best I can say about that. Thanks for the question, though, because I think that's important.
I think that if I could follow up on that, I think, part of what, as I was looking back over some of my favorite of your books, one of the things that struck me was that, because you are reading these as philosophical works themselves rather than expressing some philosophy, and then rather than expressing sort of symptomatically something that's happening as a representation of an ideological position, for example, in a different way of reading, you're really thinking about how they are doing philosophy. Each one of your, I was thinking about this book, Extreme Fabulations, is a book that's about constraint, whereas Discognition is a book that's about novelty, right? Each of the stories that you're interested in is about how novelty is produced alongside cognition, but not the same as the act of thinking. There's some surplus that undergirds thinking that's more like fabulation or fictioning. Whereas this one is about the way that fiction provides constraints that shows us that things can go in many directions once they're established, so we can't really know enough to control the future. Whereas something like, post-cinematic affect is about how each one of the things, the objects that you take up is conveying feeling. So, it seemed like each one of them has a kind of project that the texts are all contributing to. Am I right in that feeling?
I think so, but I mean, it's also, this is still answering Betsy's question. I think I try to, sometimes I write about the same text that everybody else seems to be writing about, like Lovecraft, who I mentioned in my current work in progress. I have a whole thing on him, and they seem unavoidable, but it's also kind of a feeling that there's so much out there that it's kind of depressing when people focus on the same thing. It's sort of like, here's like a classic example of sort of Herman Melville's short story, Bartleby. It's certainly one of the greatest stories of the 19th century, but it kind of, Gilles in Europe, Gilles Deleuze wrote about Bartleby, Giorgio Agamben wrote about Bartleby, Slavoj Žižek wrote about Bartleby. I'm sure I'm forgetting some other major European philosophers wrote about Bartleby. So when I see one of my fellow academics also writing about Bartleby, I always think, come on, Bartleby is wonderful, but hasn't enough been done with Bartleby? Couldn't you write about something else instead? I haven't done it myself, but I was floating the idea that if you're thinking about Melville, maybe The Confidence Man is the one we should be reading for the age of Trump instead of Bartleby. It's just, but that's sort of a joke, but the whole point is that there's just so much out there that it's depressing to be limited to just a few canonical texts. I'm not saying everything's of equal worth, and some things I find, I've my own taste as much as anybody does. There's some things I love, some things I like, and some things I find boring and all this kind of stuff. But there's really a wide range of stuff. And especially when you're talking about more present stuff, a lot of the past has been winnowed. I read some estimate that almost nobody's read, there were so many novels published in English in the 19th century that probably 95% of them nobody, living today has ever read or something like that. But nonetheless, there's still lots of different stuff, and you don't always have to say, maybe if you look at different texts or than other people look at, you might get different ideas that other people have gotten, because, there's just so much out there.
I think that there was somebody who had a hand up that I'd like to invite to come back if they would like to. But also anybody else who's interested in participating in this conversation. We have a few more minutes. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you very much for a stimulating conversation. I have lots of questions.
Okay.
I'm going to ask one.
Sure.
At the beginning of your conversation, Professor Shaviro, you said something about speculative literature being anti-nationalist. And I was wondering if you could talk more about that.
Did I actually say that? I'm not.
If I didn't understand, then
I'm trying to remember what I did say, because I can't. I think.
So let me rephrase my question.
Okay.
What do you think about speculative literature and nationalism, or do you think that speculative literature, science fiction, fantasy is inherently culturally linked, or is there something?
I think. I think it can go different ways. One of the most popular subgenres of science fiction in terms of book sales, which I never read, is military science fiction. And a lot of it, I mean, it goes back to classic mid-20th century works like Robert Heinlein is one of the most important science fiction writers of the mid-20th century. But I mean, it's like, it just sounds kind of horrific to me, and I don't want to read it because it's all about, you know, having better guns and, you know, killing everybody and stuff. You know, I mean, not that I don't, a lot of science fiction set in the far future doesn't have, you know, space battles and things like that. But it's a kind of very particular kind of direction, which just I find kind of distasteful. But again, I don't think speculative fiction is inherently progressive or liberating. I mean, speculation can involve a lot of things, so it can all go in very many different ways. So, I mean, I've read, I mean, I don't know, here's something which I feel I don't want to read, but I might have to read. So there's been a lot of important books recently about climate change. One of my favorite books the last few years is The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. Robinson is a progressive, a kind of a socialist, and he tries to imagine how we could actually avoid disaster and solve climate change. And his book is very big, and it massively talks about many different techniques which end up being used in the course of the book. And by the end of the book, after 500 pages, they've reached a situation maybe 50 years from now where we've alleviated, though not eliminated, the danger of global warming. And the book is almost encyclopedic. He has everything from terrorism to geoengineering to new financial policies as ways of alleviating the dangers of the climate. It's very kind of multifarious and so on. And there's a book was just published a few months ago, Termination Shock by Neil Stephenson, who's another major science fiction writer. I said this, I haven't read it, but after what I've read about it makes me think I have to, because I really don't like commenting on things just on the basis of what I've heard about them secondhand. But what I've heard about this book secondhand, which makes me feel I ought to read it, is that it basically is an argument for geoengineering as opposed to all other methods, and visionary capitalists as opposed to international, you know, cooperation and green activism and things like that. And I sort of feel I have to read it because it's obviously, he's a major science fiction artist, obviously contributing to this discussion. His ideology is one I dislike, but I shouldn't just take it on the faith of what people have said about it. It sounds like the antagonism between these two books is totally different visions of how we could resolve climate change, is itself a kind of important subject. So I'm giving that example and feeling that at some point I'm going to probably have to read this book, just because I don't think that somehow magically or automatically science fiction is going to necessarily be progressive or liberating or anything like that. It can be all kinds of. There's another story I heard is that there was in Russia, or in Russian language, there was a trend in the early 21st century called turbo realism, which none of the books have been translated, but it was apparently a kind of post-Soviet equivalent of cyberpunk in North America and England in the 1980s and 90s. So very high tech, very advanced technologies, people uniting with machines in various ways and so on. But it turns out that one of the major writers of this turbo realist science fiction is currently, it has been for since 2014, a warlord who's one of the leaders of the Donbass, so-called Donbass People's Republic, which is one of the puppet states carved out of Ukraine by Putin, starting in 2014 and prior to the current events. So here's a science fiction writer who's actually, a dictator who's almost certainly murdered lots of people and enriched himself at others' expense, So it's kind of, thinking about something like that means you're not going to think that a science fiction writer has to be a good guy or something, I mean, it's kind of, I've been meaning to read this guy, one of his short stories have been translated. I'm meaning to track it down and read it just to get a sense of what's going on. But his novels haven't been translated, so this is all secondhand. But apparently it's true that the published, well-known Russian science fiction writer, or Russian language science fiction writer in Ukraine is now part of Putin's puppet state. So,
But I want to make sure that we're getting to the heart of your question.
Yeah. Am I or not?
She should unmute herself.
I am trying.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for some reason it would not let me unmute. So thank you. To be frank, yeah, my question was more to do with whether different cultural backgrounds or sort of the different cultures and different nationalities might produce different kinds of speculative literature, different kinds of science fiction.
Yeah. No, I'm quite sure they do, to the limited extent that I've been able to. I mean, part of it has to do with my own my own linguistic limits. But I mean, in the last 10 years, there's been an increasing amount of science fiction from other countries and other parts of the world being translated into English. And so I've read some of the Chinese science fiction, recent Chinese science fiction translation. There are other stuff, I mean, there's been a lot of Latin American science fiction. There's been a lot of science fiction from South Asia, India, and Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And I haven't read very much of this, but from the little I've read, I think, yes, it's certainly true that, I mean, since obviously technology is never independent of the cultural constraints and cultural conditions, and the same technologies adapted in different cultures and different societies will have very different effects. So yeah, that's one thing which is, to my pleasure, gotten to be a much bigger thing in recent years, but we're still behind in terms of, I mean, I try to read lots of different things, but obviously there's much more published than I can read. And as I said, some of these things have only started to be translated. So, I mean, I recently read some South Korean science fiction translated. I've read some Chinese. Latin American, I haven't read enough, partly because I sort of can read Spanish, but not fluently enough to really do well with it. So I said, why should I read an English translation when I have the Spanish? But then the Spanish is too difficult for me. So, no, but I mean, there's definitely been interesting science fiction from Cuba, from Argentina, from Brazil, and so on. So again, I think you're totally right, and it's another reason why one should try to avoid making overly global statements. Which, I mean, I can't avoid making overly global statements, but I want to be always aware of the constraints and limitations of them, because there's more capacious stuff going on, even in this one kind of genre of speculative fiction, or set of genres of speculative fiction, than any of these formulas can really encompass. So I hope that answers.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
If folks are, this may not be exactly what you were asking about, but if folks are interested in scholarship on works in science fiction works that are not written in English, there are a bunch of issues of Paradoxa, the literary journal, that are devoted to that subject. I think we have time for one more question.
Do I get to ask the other question, or?
Yeah, go for it.
Go for it.
Well, I don't want to dominate. I mean,
no, it's fine. It's fine.
I have two more questions. So I'll pick one. I was thinking about Kantian, Kantian science fiction, and I've always thought of Frankenstein as a Kantian science fiction book. I always thought about it because of the spatiality. So my field of research, I'm interested in spatiality. I'm always interested in where things happen.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know what you thought of this, of Frankenstein as a Kantian.
That's sure. I mean, that makes sense to me, but it isn't invoked as specifically as in the two books I talked about. I mean, you don't have massive citations of Kant throughout the text of the novel. But in terms, Frankenstein's one of the most important books in this tradition of speculative fiction. And it's really, my old friend John Reeder, who wrote one of the best books about genre definitions in relation to popular and high literature, and especially in relation to science fiction, points out that you know, basically Frankenstein was not a science fiction novel when it was published in 1818 because science fiction didn't exist in 1818. It would have been classified and probably was by readers as a Gothic novel, which was a popular genre at the time with certain, you know, elements having to do with scientific discoveries. But, you know, today it is, you know, a science fiction novel, or one of the first science fiction novels, or one of the beginnings of science fiction or speculative fiction. And that, you know, so books like that both change, you know, they change the context in which they're written, and that allows them to be recontextualized in turn. So I mean, there's a lot of stuff in Frankenstein. I mean, it's obviously one of my all-time favorite books, and there's a lot of stuff there. In terms of the circles of Mary Shelley, Percy Shelley, and Lord Byron, they were probably more familiar with the British empiricist philosophy, which Kant was trying to react against, than they were with Kant himself. It's unclear. And Coleridge, among the British romantics, Coleridge clearly read Kant, as well as some post-Kantians like Schelling. It's unclear whether either the Shelleys or Byron ever read. I mean, I don't know. I started actually my dissertation in the prehistoric ages was about British romantic poetry. So I still retain, I mean, a love for all those people. I mean, I have this fetish for like movies about Mary Shelley, Percy Shelley, and Lord Byron, which there are about half a dozen, you know, reimagining their kind of circle and their kind of over-the-top ways that they acted, and also the brilliant things they wrote. So, you know, so I mean, I'd say sure, because it's part of that history. It's part of the similar history of thought. I mean, the large problem of how science relates to humanistic studies is a big issue for Kant, and I would kind of argue that different things happening today are still different. Kant tried to, you know, make a solution between competing schools of rationalism and empiricism, or of science and religious and metaphysical thoughts, and I think a lot of more recent philosophy just goes back to his terms and tries to renegotiate the terms, but it's still the same terms. So that's a kind of roundabout answer, but I mean, but I'll say sure.
No, it's I think that's a long conversation there.
Yeah. Did you have one more question? You said you had two.
Oh, no, I feel like I've really taken enough.
Well, thanks for your questions. In any case.
Thank you.
Is anybody else?
It looks like we have Betsy, I think, who wants to sort of wrap up our time.
Okay, that's fine.
For Ben as well. Betsy, what do you think?
If you want to go ahead with Ben, we have just a couple minutes left.
Okay.
Great, please, Ben.
Hi, great talk. I just wanted to ask about the role of the medium that the science fiction is being produced in.
Yeah.
Whether this changes those functions and the function of the science fiction as a process of thinking through possibility. Mm-hmm. Does a science fiction film or a speculation created by an algorithm for a speculative finance person?
Yeah.
Does that medium specificity matter?
Yeah. It does matter a lot. And I mean, I have a peculiar position in this. I mean, what I actually teach is not literature, but film mostly, and media. But I actually, when I do film, I actually am not that interested in science fiction films. I mean, there were some great science fiction films, but I don't find it as vital a genre. And so I mostly write about written science fiction. I think part of the reason for that is because of money. You know, it's so much more expensive to make a movie than it is to write a novel. So when it's relatively cheap, I think you can be more speculative. You can do wilder and crazier and more, you know, leap into the unknown types of things. Whereas movies have to worry much more about making back the money because they cost so much more, and therefore have to be much more restricted in their restraints. So that's one kind of answer of why I tend to turn to science fiction, written science fiction, rather than science fiction cinema. The other thing is, I mean, basically, the other thing at this point that I'm mostly writing about in my scholarly writing is music videos. And there are a number of reasons why I'm interested in music videos, but there's kind of a post-movie cinematic form which has relations both to movies, but also to other things because it's, pop music, which has its own histories and own intertwined things. And this is way too kind of corny and simplistic, but if I had to have a formula, I'd say music videos are there are many reasons why music videos are interesting, both because I like a lot of the music and the video adds additional, when it's done well done, adds additional dimensions to music, but also because they're not constrained by the rules of narrative mainstream films, they are much more experimental than movies tend to be in some of the things they do just formalistically, as well as in terms of presentation and stuff. And so my sort of admittedly overly simplistic formula is that if I'm looking about questions of potentiality and futurity, music videos have that in formal terms, whereas the content is kind of banal and familiar, and science fiction has it in content terms, so the forms are usually traditional mimetic fiction style of writing, and so therefore conservative and not that interesting. And so, I mean, I know that's way too simplistic, but that's sort of one of the schemas by which I divide up my current research, I guess.
So if I could throw out the last question and simply
Yes,
ask,
please.
you've mentioned current research, I think in terms of music videos, you had previously said that you're doing some work with Lovecraft. I was wondering if you could give us a very brief snapshot of what we should be looking for as maybe the next publication. Okay,
well, I actually just about a week ago sent in the final manuscript of my next book to Bloomsbury Academic Press. And it's a book about music videos called The Rhythm Image. It's a bit overdetermined, The Rhythm Image. So the philosopher Gilles Deleuze wrote two books about cinema, one called The Movement Image and the other called The Time Image. And it's a kind of classification of different cinematic styles, but it's also a kind of historical difference between classic cinema and modernist cinema. Now, Deleuze wrote these books in the 1880s and he died in the 1980s and he died in the 1990s. So a lot has changed, especially because of digitization in audiovisual media since then. So I'm maybe about the fifth or sixth person to propose, here's what Deleuze's third volume should have been, what if he had lived to write a third volume. So my third volume is called The Rhythm Image. However, I'm less concerned with the philosophy, though I use it as a framework, and I'm more concerned with looking at particular music videos, which again, as with the science fiction writings in this book, I've been criticized for just arbitrarily choosing ones, and I can't really give any justification beyond that. These are all ones which I think are really cool, which I like. But so that's my next book. And as I said, I just spent the last 3 or 4 months doing rewrites, and it's just gone into production. Hopefully, it'll be around published the end of this year, beginning of next year. And then beyond that, I'm in the middle of writing another book with science fiction, but I don't know when I'll finish that or who will publish it yet.
Well, congratulations.
So,
I wish I were nearly as productive over the last 2 years in the middle of the pandemic.
Well, the pandemic actually helps because, let's put it this way, I have very little social life to begin with, but the pandemic meant that I did less of one than usual, so I had more time to write.
Well, thank you for giving us the heads up. Congratulations on having that manuscript out and the next book in production. Congratulations as well on publication of Extreme Fabulations. Thank you for joining us, all of you today. If we could end with a round of applause for both Steve, our author, and Rebecca, who very, very nicely, I appreciate it, worked our way through this contribution to the field of science fiction. Thank you all. If you didn't see, Jacqueline did post the link for the press for purchasing that within the chat. So if you do not yet have your copy and you'd like to purchase one, you can get the link there. But again, thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate it. I hope you have a good rest of the day.
Okay. Thank you, especially to Rebecca for facilitating this, to Betsy and Walter and Jacqueline for the Humanities Center sponsorship and setting all of this up. It was great for me. So thanks to everybody who came.
Thank you all. Thank you.